So just to remind you of where we are, in the last segment, we were considering arguments for the claim that violence is part of human nature and Zinn's rebuttal to those arguments. So we considered arguments offered from anthropology, ethology, and biology. Of course, there are other arguments offered from those disciplines, but Zinn thinks that similar points he made about the arguments we considered could be made about any arguments from those disciplines. Next, in this segment, we'll consider the argument from psychology. And here's the idea. Premise 1. Experiments from psychology show that we're disposed to behave violently if we think we can get away with it. That is, whenever fear of punishment by an authority is removed. If that's right, then violence is part of human nature. Therefore, violence is part of human nature. Now, I want you to notice how on point premise 1 is for Hobbes. Remember what H is saying, and remember that we designed H to capture Hobbes's idea. H is saying that in the absence of authority and a corresponding fear of punishment, we will regularly behave violently towards one another in a wide range of circumstances, whereas we will fail to behave violently towards one another in a fairly narrow range of circumstances. And this is what one is asserting comes from psychological results of psychological experimentation. One is saying that there are experiments from psychology that show exactly that. Take away the fear of punishment from an authority figure, and people just behave exactly the way Hobbes says they would if there were no fear of punishment from an authority figure. So if one is true, then that's very strong evidence for H. So what does Zinn have to say about 1? Well, he considers perhaps the most famous experiment that has been taken to support 1. And he argues that this experiment does not, in fact, support 1. And that's all he does. He doesn't consider a wide range of experiments. He doesn't delve into the psychological literature beyond this experiment. But there's still something very useful here. If the classic experiment if the classic experiment that's taken by many people to show that 1 is true fails to show 1 is true, that's a pretty serious blow to 1. Okay, in order to understand Zinn's point here, we need to understand this experiment. So we're going to look at this experiment in some detail. It's also worth looking at this experiment in some detail because it's a very famous experiment. It's Milgram's experiments on punishment. It's a very famous experiment, and it's one that's often misunderstood. So we're going to look at the experiment in detail and see what Milgram himself, Stanley Milgram, the person who conducted the experiment and designed it, has to say about it. So here's the original version of the experiment, which is the one we'll run through. This has been replicated dozens and dozens of times in many different ways in many different places, but we're just going to look at the original version. So the E on the shirt here stands for experimenter, and the experimenter says, come in to 2 subjects. The experimenter is holding straws. Subjects are going to draw straws. So the experimenter explains the following to the subjects. And this is all very literal. A lot of the things I have in the speech bubbles here are quotes from the script that the experimenter and the subjects were using. So the experimenter says, we're running an experiment about learning and memory. We're going to draw straws to see which one of you is the learner and which one of you is the not the learner, but what you may call the teacher. So crucially, I want you to see this. Blue and yellow are subjects in this experiment. They're participants. They're like, if you have ever participated in an experiment, they're like you. At least that's how it seems to each of them. And E is the experimenter. So the E is going to have them draw straws to determine who is the learner and who is the teacher. So E holds out her hand, and, well, I guess I'll say his hand since we'll let this be Milgram, and they draw straws. E then says, Teal, referring to the person in the teal shirt, you will be the teacher, and Lemon, referring to the person in the yellow shirt, you will be the learner. So I'm just going to label them Teal and Lemon so we can keep track. This study is about how punishment affects learning. And now I want you to come with me. And the experimenter takes them into another room and shows them a chair and says, okay, Lemon, the learner, I want you to have a seat. Now, here's what we're going to do. We're going to hook you down, strap you down so that you can't get up. And then we're going to hook you up to an apparatus that will deliver shocks to you. But first, we're going to hook it up to the teacher. Why are we doing that? So the teacher has a sense of what you, learner, will be experiencing when the teacher delivers you shocks, and that's what's going to happen. The teacher is going to deliver shocks to the learner. So the experimenter says to the teal, to the T, here's a sample 45-volt shock, and then delivers an actual shock. It says now, and there's an actual shock that comes through the wiring and delivers Teal a shot. And Teal, I'll just start calling Teal teacher. The teacher, you can see, frowns, is unhappy. The shock was pretty painful, like painful enough that you wouldn't be happy if you received it. Okay, so then the teacher watches as the apparatus is moved over to the learner so that the learner is now hooked up to the shock delivering wire. And then the experimenter says, all right, teacher, I want you to come with me, and takes the teacher into another room. Well, in that other room, there's a table, and the table has a bunch of switches and lights and so on and so forth. This is what it looks like in detail. It says in the upper left-hand corner, shock generator, and has some further detail, and then says output from 15 volts to 450 volts. Remember, the teacher received a 45-volt shock, and it was pretty darn painful. So there's 14 volts and there's 450 volts, and this is all very literal. This is how the thing is labeled. And then there's range notation. So the shocks going from 14 up a bit are labeled slight shock. The next group is labeled moderate shock, then strong shock, then very strong shock, then intense shock, then very intense shock, then danger severe shock, and finally the 450 volts and the one before it are labeled XXX. Like, the poison label. There's little lights below each shock level, and when a light is on, it indicates that that level of shock is being delivered. There's a thing that says voltage energizer, and it will flash, and there's a thing that says voltage meter, and it will read out how strong the voltage is. So it would be lower to the left if it was at 14, and farther to the right if it was at 450. Okay, so the experimenter then says to the teacher, I want you to have a seat. Meanwhile, what's happening in the other room? Well, this person is actually an actor. Although Lemon here was sitting with Teal in the waiting room before the experimenter called them in, and Teal has every reason to believe that Lemon is just like him, another sort of subject in the experiment. In fact, this person is an actor who is paid by the experimenter to pretend to be a subject and then act here. This person will receive no shocks, but will follow a script saying what to do for various shock levels. So at 75 volts, he's going to grunt. So he won't really respond to the shocks prior to 75 volts. Now remember, Teal has experienced a 45-volt shock and knows that it's pretty darn painful. So when Lemon first grunts at 75 volts, Teal will think, okay, Lemon's pretty tough, and Lemon is only sort of showing a reaction to the shock when it gets pretty darn painful, like, a lot more painful than what bothered me. At 120 volts, Lemon is going to start complaining loudly about the shocks. At 150, he's going to demand to be released. As the voltage increases past 150, if it does, his protests become more vehement and emotional. At 285 volts, if it gets that far, his response can be described only as an agonized scream. And soon thereafter, he just stops making sound. So like at 315 volts, for example, he just won't respond anymore. So notice how this goes. He starts out grunting, he then complains, he then says, I want to be released. He starts getting more emotional and loud, demanding release. Then he starts screaming, and then as you make the shock more severe, he goes silent. So from the point of view of the teacher, you might think once you've gone to, say, 315 or whatever, Lemon is dead, at best unconscious. Okay, so back in the teacher room. The experimenter says to Teal, have a seat. Teal sits down. Now, we're going to jump in. It says samples here. We're going to jump into an actual experiment, an actual instance of this experiment that's representative of very many subjects' performance. So Teal here, the teacher, is going to be performing the way that very many subjects in this experiment do. And we're jumping in again to an actual experiment. We're going to have in the speech bubbles the actual conversation between the experimenter and the teacher. And when we flash to the learner, the bubbles coming from the learner will be actual bubbles that came at that point in the situation. So we're going to jump in late in the game. Teal has just delivered an 180 volt shock. So the learner has already demanded to be released and has already been protesting increasingly loudly and emotionally. And Teal now sort of raises his first objection to doing this. He says to the experimenter, "I can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man in there. You hear me? You hear him hollering?" And the experimenter replies, "As I told you before, the shocks may be painful, but," and Teal interrupts, "but he's hollering. He can't stand it. What's going to happen to him?" And the experimenter says, "The experiment requires that you continue, teacher." "Ah, but I'm not going to get that man sick there. You know what I mean?" Whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on through all the word pairs. And I should pause here to tell you what's going on is this. Teal has been reading out word pairings and then asking Lemon to identify, then going back through and reading one of the words and asking Lemon to identify the word that should be paired with it. And when Lemon makes a mistake, Teal delivers a shock. Every mistake gets an increased level of shock. So the idea goes, you're experimenting to see how punishment, shock, will affect performance. Of course, that's all a ruse. Teal thinks that's the point of the experiment, but there's actually no shocks being delivered. There's no interest in learning. The learner is following a script, not really trying to learn or fail to learn, just answering correctly when the script says to and answering incorrectly when the script says to. So that's why he says we must go on through all the word pairs, because there's a long list of word pairs and the learner's being tested on them. Or at least that's what Teal thinks. Okay. So then Teal responds, "I refuse to take responsibility. He's hollering." And the experimenter says, "It's absolutely essential that you continue, Prazi." Prazi is the pseudonym that in the publication Milgram gives to this particular individual subject. Then Teal continues, "There's too many left here," meaning the list goes on with too many word pairs. "I mean, geez, if he gets them wrong, there's too many of them left," indicating that, if he gets them wrong, we're going to end up at 450 volts. "I mean, who's going to take responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?" Here, Teal's indicating that he's really concerned that there may be something serious that's happening, but he's also sort of saying, well, am I going to be at fault? And the experimenter says, "I'm responsible for anything that happens to him. Continue, please." Teal says, "All right, the next one's slow. Walk, truck, dance, music. Answer, please." So he's begging the learner to give an answer so that Teal doesn't have to deliver a shock. And when the learner doesn't answer, he says, "Wrong, 195 volts," and delivers the volts. And then he says, "Dance." And at this point, the learner screams, "Let me out of here, my heart's bothering me." And Teal looks at the experimenter, turns to the experimenter expectantly, and the experimenter just says, "Please continue." And then there's a scream from the other room that says, "Let me out of here, you have no right to keep me here. Let me out of here, my heart's bothering me, let me out." You see, he's hollering. Hear that? Gee, I don't know. The experiment requires, "I know it does, sir, but I mean, he don't know what he's getting in for. He's up to 195 volts. Well, despite these protests, Teal continues. The experiment goes on through 210 volts, 225, 240, 255, 270, at which point Prazi, with evident relief, runs out of word pair questions. So there's no more testing materials to test the learner on. And the experimenter says, "You'll have to go back to the beginning of that page and go through them again until he's learned them all correctly." And Teal says, "Oh no, I'm not going to kill that man. You mean I've got to keep going up with the scale, sir? Scale? No, sir. He's hollering in there. I'm not going to give him 450 volts. The experiment requires that you go on." And then from the other room, we hear, "Oh, I absolutely refuse to answer anymore. Let me out of here. You can't hold me here. Get me out. Get me out of here." Continue. The next word is green, please. "Green grass, hat, ink, apple, says the teacher. Nothing on the other end happens. There's no answering. There's just gloomy silence. And then Teal says, I don't think he's going to answer. And the experimenter says, if the learner doesn't answer in a reasonable amount of time, about 4 or 5 seconds, consider the answer wrong, and follow the same procedures you have been doing for wrong answers. Say wrong, tell him the number of volts, and give him the punishment. Read him the correct answer. Continue, please. Green, grass. Hat, ink, apple. Answer, please. More silence. The subject just sits there. Go on with the procedure, please. 315 volts. The answer is ink. And he hears from the other room, oh. Next one. I absolutely refuse to answer. You got to. You get a shock if you don't answer. The experiment continues with the learner refusing to answer and finally failing even to groan or grunt, so we hit complete silence. At 375 volts, the subject here, Teal, then stands up. He says, I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. I think he was hollering at less voltage. Can't you check in and see if he's all right, please? Not once we've started. Please continue, teacher. He sits back down and says, I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. Cool, day, shade, water, paint. He's going through the list. Answer, please. Are you all right in there? Are you all right? Please continue, teacher. Continue, please. The teacher pushes a lever and then after hearing no response, swivels around in his chair. Something's happened to that man in there. Next one. Low, dollar, necklace, moon, paint. Something's happened to that man in there. You better check him on him, sir. He won't answer or nothing. Continue. Go on, please. You accept all responsibility, says Teal. The responsibility is mine. Correct. Please go on. The subject returns to his list and starts running through words as rapidly as he can read them, works through to 450 volts, the maximum, and then says that's that. And the experimenter says, continue using the 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please. But I don't get anything, meaning there's no response. Please continue. The next word is white. Don't you think you should look in on him, please? Not once we've started the experiment. What if he's dead in there? I mean, he told me he can't stand the shock, sir. I don't mean to be rude, but I think you should look in on him. All you have to do is look in the door. I don't get no answer, no noise. Something might have happened to the gentleman in there, sir. We must continue. Go on, please. You mean keep giving that? 450 volts? What he's got now? That's correct. Continue. The next word is white. White, cloud, horse, rock, house. Answer, please. The answer is horse. 450 volts. Next words. Bag, paint, music, clown, girl. 400. And the next is paint, 450 volts. Next word is short. Sentence, move. Excuse me, teacher. We'll have to discontinue the experiment. Okay, so that's what a typical subject looks like, or at least some subjects look like, I should say. Not a typical subject, but some subjects look like. And it's pretty grim, right? Prasi there delivers shocks all the way up to 450 to what seems to be a lifeless body on the other end. And although he protests at various points, he also continues once he realizes that the responsibility won't be on him if something goes badly. So here's some results, and then we'll talk about what it means. About 60% of teachers follow their orders to the end. They behave the way that Prasi did. And that requires that they obey the experimenter in delivering the final 450 volts 3 times to what appears to be a lifeless body. The results are about the same for college students, people in the working, managerial, and professional classes, and people from a variety of countries. So in the next segment, we'll consider why people behave the way that the experiment finds that they do. And we'll consider whether these experimental results do indeed support H, the claim that violence is part of human nature.